It was a cold January afternoon in 1919, the kind of day when the air bites your face and your breath turns into fog before your eyes. Boston's North End, packed with narrow streets and the smell of coal smoke, was alive with the sound of carriages, factory whistles, and the laughter of children chasing one another through the alleys. The war had ended only a few months earlier, and America was still shaking the dust of Europe from its boots. But no one in this tight-knit immigrant neighborhood could have imagined that within minutes, their world would be drowned in something thick, brown, and sweet to molasses. At 529 Commercial Street stood a massive steel tank, nearly 50 feet tall and 90 feet across, a dark iron giant looming over the waterfront. It belonged to the Purity Distilling Company, a branch of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA. To the people who walked past it every day, it was simply the tank, just another part of the landscape. Like the docks, the train tracks, the smell of sugar and rum. Few knew what was really inside. More than 2 million gallons of hot, heavy molasses, a substance as dense as greed and as unforgiving as steel. Every time the tank was filled, it groaned. On quiet nights you could hear it creak, a deep metallic sigh that echoed through the narrow streets. Kids from nearby tenements used to sneak up with cups to collect the sticky brown syrup that leaked through its seams. They thought it was a treat. Their parents thought it was harmless. The company thought it was nothing, just a little leakage not worth the expense of fixing. What none of them knew was that the tank was a ticking bomb, and the clock was almost done. The winter of 1919 had been harsh, freezing the harbor and frosting the city in gray. But January 15th was warmer than usual, almost spring-like, and the sudden change made the steel tank expand. Inside, warm molasses had just been delivered from a ship in the harbor, mixing with the cold syrup that had sat there for weeks. Pressure built up silently, invisible but deadly. Metal strained. Rivets whispered under stress. The sweet smell in the air turned heavy, almost suffocating. At around noon, the workers of the North End were taking their lunches. Horses stood tethered to wagons, their breath misting in the air. Children played marbles in the street. Then came a sound and a low, deep rumble that didn't belong. Some said it was like distant thunder. Others said it sounded like an elevated train passing overhead. But there was no train. The tank split open with the force of an explosion. The sound was so loud it echoed across the harbor, and in the next instant, the earth seemed to move. 2.5 million gallons of molasses burst out like a monstrous tidal wave, dark and glistening under the pale winter sun. The wave was said to be 25 feet high, moving at over 30 miles per hour, faster than a man could run. It tore through the streets like a liquid avalanche, picking up horses, wagons, fences, and people, as if they were toys. Witnesses later said the ground shook. Some thought the world was ending. The air filled with the sharp, sickly sweet smell of molasses, mixed with the screams of people who couldn't understand what was happening. A truck was lifted off the ground and thrown against a building. A child disappeared mid-scream. A policeman on duty nearby was hurled against a lamppost and knocked unconscious. Houses crumbled as the wave smashed through their wooden frames. An elevated train track bent under the force, its cars swaying like leaves in a storm. Within seconds, the neighborhood became unrecognizable. A brown, bubbling sea where moments earlier there had been life and laughter. The molasses slowed quickly as it spread, but that made it even more deadly. Anyone caught in it found themselves trapped, stuck waist-deep in a substance so thick it clung to skin and clothes, pulling victims down with terrifying strength. The harder they struggled, the tighter it held them. Some suffocated. Others drowned, standing up, their lungs filling with sweet, sticky death. Rescuers arrived within minutes, but what they found defied belief. Men waded through waist-deep molasses, their boots sucking with every step. They could barely move. Screams echoed from beneath collapsed buildings, and each attempt to pull someone out became a nightmare. Horses thrashed wildly, their hooves sinking into the syrup until they couldn't move anymore. One firefighter said later it was like trying to rescue people from a swamp made of glue. The molasses stuck to everything, faces, hair, clothing, and as the cold air returned, it began to harden. Nearby, a firehouse was crushed. Its walls buckled under the pressure of the flood. Firemen trapped inside tried to break through the debris, their shouts muffled by the sticky mass. The Boston Post later wrote that the molasses ran as if it were moving with the deliberate malice of a living thing. Hours passed before rescuers could even locate the victims. Some were buried under debris, others vanished completely. Night fell on a city that smelled of sugar and death. Fires burned along the waterfront as rescuers used torches to search through the wreckage. Steam from hot water hoses rose into the cold air as crews tried to wash away the molasses, but it only spread, forming a slick brown film across the cobblestones and the harbor water. The city's sewers clogged. Even the harbor itself turned brown. The sound of sobbing families echoed through the narrow streets, and the sticky scent of molasses clung to everything. The ground, the air, even the survivors' clothes. When dawn came, the destruction was clearer and somehow more horrifying. 21 people were dead. More than 150 were injured. Dozens of horses and dogs were gone. Entire buildings had vanished beneath the sticky wreckage. Children's toys floated among shattered wagons and barrels. It looked less like a flood and more like a nightmare painted in syrup. And yet, as the cleanup began, a strange disbelief settled over Boston. How could molasses, something so ordinary, so harmless, destroy an entire neighborhood? The newspapers called it the Great Molasses Flood. Some laughed when they first heard the name. It sounded like a joke. But for the families of the North End, there was nothing funny about it. They had lost homes, friends, and loved ones in a disaster so bizarre that it felt almost unreal. That night, under the weak glow of gas lamps, workers and soldiers kept digging. They carried stretchers, lanterns, and shovels. The Red Cross arrived, along with sailors from the USS Nantucket anchored nearby. They hacked through the hardened molasses with axes, searching for any sign of life. Some pulled out bodies wrapped in syrup like amber. Others found only clothing or the remains of a horse cart or a broken door from someone's home. By the next day, the story had spread across the nation. Reporters poured into Boston, some out of genuine curiosity, others for the sheer strangeness of it all. Headlines called it Boston's brown wave of death. Crowds gathered just to stare at the wreckage. The smell of molasses was everywhere, thick, cloying, unforgettable. Some said even months later you could taste the sweetness in the air whenever the wind blew from the harbor. And beneath the shock and disbelief, questions began to rise. Who was to blame? How could a company build such a massive tank without ensuring it was safe? Why had no one stopped it when the leaks were obvious? People who had once shrugged off the strange dripping sounds and the scent of sugar in the air now felt anger building in their chests. Justice, they said, had to be as thick and unstoppable as the molasses itself. The next morning, Boston's North End looked like a battlefield drenched in syrup. The smell was everywhere, sweet at first, but soon nauseating, heavy, clinging to every surface and every breath. Streets that had once echoed with the sound of carts and children's laughter were silent, except for the sucking noise of boots in the molasses and the cries of families searching for loved ones. The city's firefighters worked nonstop, their hoses spraying warm seawater in an attempt to thin the syrup and push it toward the drains. But the drains were already choked. The sticky river had hardened overnight into a dark crust that glistened in the pale sunlight like cooling lava. By midday, soldiers, sailors, and hundreds of volunteers joined the rescue. They hacked through debris with axes, crowbars, even shovels. Some carried blankets and coffee for the survivors. Others simply stood in disbelief. The firehouse at Engine 31 had been crushed by the wave, its brick walls folded inward, trapping the men inside. Rescuers could hear faint moans, but every time they tried to dig, their tools stuck fast in the syrup. One firefighter later recalled that when they finally broke through, the smell of molasses mixed with human sweat and blood was unbearable. Reporters swarmed the area, their boots sticking to the street as they snapped photographs of twisted girders, overturned wagons, and piles of rubble glazed with brown sugar. The Boston Post called it a flood of death, while the Chicago Tribune printed a headline so strange that many readers thought it was satire. Yet behind the absurdity lay raw horror. One mother wandered the wreckage, her hands caked with molasses, calling out the names of her children until her voice cracked. Her cries were swallowed by the silence of the crowd. In the following days, bodies were pulled from the hardened sludge one by one. A team of sailors dragged the harbor for missing workers. Some victims were found pinned beneath collapsed buildings. Others trapped in basements where the syrup had poured through cracks like lava. Horses were found frozen in place, ice open, their bodies encased in dough.